Okay, welcome back everyone. My name is Sam Raskoff. I'm a professor here at the law school, and I work on areas pertaining to national security, to cybersecurity, and nowadays also to AI, as one does. We have an extraordinary set of panelists here to talk about all the ways, many of the ways, in which artificial intelligence and issues of national security and issues of ethics and issues of law and issues of regulation interact with each other. But before we do, here's what I'm going to say. This panel has been approved for 1 CLE credit in areas of professional practice and 0.5 credits in cybersecurity, privacy, and data protection general. For attendees here in the room seeking CLE credit, if you have not already done so, please go to the CLE sign-in table and note both your arrival and departure time. In-person attendees will not be able to receive credit unless you sign both in and out. For those attending virtually, I will be announcing the CLE code later in the discussion. Okay. Sitting to my left in order are John Costello, who's a principal at West Exec Advisors, an adjunct senior fellow with the Technology and National Security Program at CNAS, and a veteran of the Office of the National Cyber Director, a pivotal new institution within the White House. To John's left is Rebecca Weiner, who's the Deputy Commissioner of Intelligence and Counterterrorism for the New York City Police Department. To Rebecca's left is Jackie Acker, who is Deputy Privacy and Civil Liberties Officer in the Office of Privacy and Civil Liberties at the Central Intelligence Agency. Last but not least, John O. Fishback, Associate Deputy General Counsel in the United States Department of Defense. So my role over the next 75 minutes is essentially going to be to get out of the way of the extraordinary talent that we have arrayed in front of you, and to allow them to help us better understand the nature of this AI national security conversation. I thought we would kick things off in what I regard as the traditional way that conversations around new threats and national security and law typically begin. And that's to get a sense of the threat picture, to kind of understand what's going on around us, if you will, the reality of things, so that we could then come to some sort of level set understanding and interact with what we then have in front of us by way of thinking of ethics, law, and regulation, and so forth. And so, in no particular order, Jono, maybe I could turn to you first and ask you to give us a little bit of a sense of how AI shows up in the inbox of the Pentagon.
Sure. First of all, can everyone hear me all right? Okay. Then clearly I need to make my voice much softer and muffle it a lot more. So first of all, Natalie, I can't start without thanking you for giving us the opportunity to be here. We don't often get to come out from places like CIA and DoD to explain what we're doing in an environment that you've tricked us into believing is safe, but we're here doing it now. And in large part, that's a testament to you and the amazing AI community that you've built within government. We hope you're going to continue to build within government. So I have a set piece. It's going to be about 5 to 7 minutes long. My children tell me that if I tell them in advance how long I'm going to be lecturing and monologuing, that it's easier for them to get through. So just to manage expectations, pace yourselves for 5 to 7 minutes, and then everything I say after that will hopefully be only in response to a question.
And John, if I have my
Sure.
math right, just to clarify, I think you get 0.00196 CLE credits for the 7-minute set piece.
On paper, but when they actually review the recording, that will drop to 0.
Okay.
So, okay.
Have at
You
it.
can measure it in sips of coffee as well.
Yeah.
That'll be a much higher number. Okay. So to level set, one thing that didn't come up at the last panel because it's an impossible question to answer is actually what is the definition of AI? How do I think about AI? What isn't AI, which turns out to be the more important question. So as I'm talking, the thumbnail understanding of AI that I have, it's pretty simple. AI is a machine making a judgment. The best definition of judgment I've seen that aligns with this concept, the forming of an opinion, estimate, notion, or conclusion as from circumstances presented to the mind. And the reason that I think of it that way is because that allows me, when I approach an AI problem, to focus on what is the judgment that we are talking about. How is that judgment being made? How is it being operationalized? And then most importantly, what is the way that we would think about and regulate that judgment if a human being were making it? So then we can apply the analogous question, which is, what is the difference between the way we regulate the human making the judgment and the way we regulate the machine making the judgment? And that ends up, at least going in, being a workable template for addressing a lot of the questions that come up. So at DoD, the way the area is kind of shaping is that there are two major branches of AI activity. The first, I would say, is hardware related. So the way that we are using AI, incorporating AI into actual military capabilities. There's a limit, obviously, to what kind of detail I can go into about this, but I think the most important takeaway is that if you want to know what DoD is thinking about the use of AI as part of military capabilities, the most important thing is that what we are vectoring towards is not a machine acting autonomously. Not only is that not a good idea, it also is not effective. Whether it will ever be effective is something I doubt, but everything that we do under the banner of what our Deputy Secretary refers to as responsible AI is designed to optimize the collaboration between the human and the machine. And as we all know, there are things machines can do that are very difficult for human beings to do manually. There are also very, very critical parts of a decision-making process that machines suck at and that where human involvement is critically important. And where if we don't have the human being involved, not only are we not doing our best for democracy, but we are not even doing our best militarily. And so thinking about how we optimize the human-machine connection when we're talking about hardware and machine capabilities is kind of one branch of thought within DoD on AI. The other branch, which is where I spend more of my time and which frankly I find much more difficult and challenging, is the area of data and data processing. So this is where we are figuring out, and I do a lot of my work in the area of intelligence, how is it that machine processing is changing not only the type of insights that we're able to extract from intelligence, but I think more importantly, and I know this is a topic that Jackie will touch on as well, how that influences the type of information that we are interested in, and particularly how, in many cases, this moves us from a world in which we do targeted intelligence collection to a world in which we are bringing in information in greater and greater bulk quantities, and oftentimes, sometimes losing focus of whether there is what we call a derogatory reason. Do we have a problem that we need to solve that scopes the parameter of what it is we're collecting, or are we just indiscriminately swallowing information and almost just going fishing for things that we might think are interesting, which is highly problematic from a legal perspective. So the issues of hardware and capabilities, and then more of the software-driven, how is it that we process all of the information that's coming in, and how are we reimagining what type of information is relevant to us from an intelligence standpoint? That's kind of the other branch. So the last piece of it, you've made it. You've survived the first 4 minutes. There are only 3 minutes left. What I wanted to do, mostly in terms of trying to stimulate audience reaction and questions, because I think these panels are best when we don't talk at you, but we're speaking with you. And our dialogue is being generated by what you're interested in and you care about, and I don't get to hear from audiences like you very often. So these are the 4 big issues that I think about in terms of the work that we're doing within DoD. I think the first issue is knowledge gathering, and that AI is putting extraordinary stress on what it is that should be the limits of the kind of knowledge that government has in a democratic form of government. And I teach intelligence law at Georgetown, and one of the questions kind of I impulsively posed to my students while we were discussing the Fourth Amendment is just try to be a real human being, which is as difficult as it is for lawyers. It's even harder for lawyers in training. Stop being a lawyer for a second, be a real person, and just tell me, when you think about the Fourth Amendment, what is the Fourth Amendment all about to you? Is the Fourth Amendment about what the government should be allowed to do? Or is it about what the government should be allowed to know? And we struggled with that question, and where we came out at the end was that we have a Fourth Amendment that was shaped kind of by colonial era views about fears about what the government can do, but where technology has taken us is to a place where we can get the most invasive form of evidence, the most invasive information imaginable, persistent information about human behaviors, while doing the most non-invasive things that you can imagine. So we have destroyed the link between the invasiveness of a government act, like a Fourth Amendment regulated search or seizure, and the type of sensitive information that we can wind up with. And what we're more concerned about now is that what we really care about is the limits of what a government should be able to know about its people. And specifically, I think whether a government should be allowed to persistently surveil large populations of people and gather information about people, none of whom may have done anything wrong or be posing any kind of threat. So the lack of any kind of, the lack of having done anything wrong. And those three things, persistency, large populations, and people who look totally innocent, that I think is something we don't want our government knowing about, and yet the Fourth Amendment can't prevent us from moving to that place because we don't need a search or seizure to get there. So where does that leave us? I think the second issue is, how do we deal with the fact that machines have a psychology and a psychiatry the same way that people do? I think that there's an implicit assumption that we can program our way to being able to finely tune and shape exactly the way a machine thinks, but that just simply isn't true. For the same reason that we can't program out of ourselves all of the irrational biases and heuristics we have, for anyone familiar with the work of Kahneman and Tversky, the idea that we make systematic mistakes, irrational mistakes when we think with our fast brain. I think as you look at the way that AI behaves over completely different projects and rule sets, that you see machines gravitate toward types of emergent thinking that aren't just difficult to follow, but that have deficiencies that look the same. And one of the things when I spoke at DARPA recently that I was encouraging their researchers to do was to try to create wildly diverse AI tasks that would be designed to detect whether machines are failing in ways that are nonetheless similar, notwithstanding the very different types of programming. So what are we doing to try to detect kind of the ways that machines gravitate toward, not just talking about biases or whatever, but how are machines gravitating toward doing things that are wrong and not what we expect? The third thing that's very clear with AI is that we have to make a trade-off. We can either choose to optimize effectiveness or we can choose to optimize accountability, but we cannot have both. So the more that we cede responsibility to a machine in any process, the harder it is to come back afterwards and say that a failure or something terrible that happened can be laid at the feet of a person who we can either get rid of or force them to change their behavior. It's very hard to it's not worth it to put a machine in prison. A machine can't feel punished, and a machine can't change directly in response to criticism. And so figuring out how we maintain the level of accountability that we expect when we're doing high-risk activities in national security and intelligence, how we reconcile that with handing over more and more responsibility to a machine is something that we should be struggling with, but right now it's a big picture issue that we're not addressing. And so, the comments made at the beginning of how we seem to be in this era where we're moving very quickly to regulate. For anyone familiar with the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, you begin with the end in mind. And none of us are talking about what is the end that we want to reach. We're just regulating because we've got something unregulated that's powerful and needs to be regulated. But what are we regulating our way towards? Kind of what larger values and principles are we trying to scaffold our way to? And then finally, and I promise you will not hear from me again until minute 50 or 55, how much of this should we be able to outsource? So there is an enormous gap between the AI that we need at DoD and the expertise that we have to develop it and create it in-house. So there's one other thing that you may or may not know about DoD. We have large piles of money. So it is much easier to get things funded at DoD, and I've been at many other places of the government where you can't even get pens that work. At DoD, we have pens that work, and billions and billions of dollars to do other things. So we are buying our way to the expertise that we are either too lazy or unable to develop in-house. And what that means is that the responsibility for doing real things that have real impacts on people through AI are oftentimes getting outsourced with much more regularity and with much less accountability and much less oversight than we are used to outsourcing things that we know have a large impact on Americans. And so where do we take that concept of activities that should be inherently governmental and apply that to kind of the rush to outsource the development and use of AI? That is a question that some of us are wrestling with that I think needs to be addressed at larger levels. But hopefully, Sam, that helps kick us off. And at this point, I'll shut up.
Well, it helps kick us off and how, but I can't guarantee you that you won't be heard from again until minute 55, sorry. Rebecca, could I turn to you now for a little bit of contrast? We just heard from the Pentagon, or from John O. I'm sure not speaking on behalf of the Pentagon.
Thank you for clarifying
yes,
that. Yes,
but employed by. But I wonder if you could give us a sense of how this issue shows up for you in your role as the overall head of counterterrorism and intelligence efforts here in the city of New York.
Sure, and that was super interesting. I want to take your intelligence law class for one. And also, I'm so excited that we're getting CLE credit. I hope that the speakers also get CLE credit for this.
Naturally.
Thanks. That was you got me to do this without the credit in mind. This is a bonus. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, everybody, for being here. So I'll start off with just a little bit of preamble on NYPD. How many people are familiar with NYPD's Intel and Counterterrorism Bureau? Okay, a couple of you. And then we'll talk about how we've been thinking about AI. And one of my brilliant analysts, I don't know if he's actually in the room, but he has been working extensively with me. His name's Matt Shear. If you see him periodically across the day, please say hello, on public safety risks associated with AI. So we are thinking less about how our agency is going to be using it and more about how we are, as law enforcement, going to be responding to it as it manifests in crimes and beyond. And I'm going to focus more on the beyond, on disinformation, because that's where we've really been seeing the impact, and we expect to be seeing more of it going forward, and have some pretty serious concerns about public safety risks associated with disinformation at scale and at cost associated with generative AI. But first, so NYPD created a counterterrorism capability that Sam was a big part of in its early years, and I've been with the department for 17 years. And this was in the aftermath of 9/11. A lot of the components that we have pre-existed 9/11, and then many others were created in its aftermath. And we array them on a basic continuum, and we love alliteration, and so everything begins with D, but from deterrence on the one hand through detection and disruption to defense. A couple of key pillars that will accomplish all of those goals. Some are overt, and if you live here in New York, you will have seen some of our counterterrorism officers around the city, particularly over the last 5 weeks, as a response to what's going on in Israel and in Gaza. Though these are what we call target hardening or deterrent efforts that are men and women in uniform, many of whom are carrying heavy weapons, who are deployed around the city to sensitive locations based on intelligence to help deter any kind of malign activity from taking place. And then on the other end of the continuum, response. So these are capabilities to respond to a complex, coordinated attack against the city. Active shooter or chem bio-rad nuclear detection and mitigation capabilities, a bomb squad, a lot of kind of the more hardcore elements that one would associate with responding to a big emergency. And in the middle, the detect and disrupt piece are investigative efforts. And this isn't just in the realm of counterterrorism, it's much more broad. But this is where we look to get ahead of people who are mobilizing toward violence in and around the city. And we think very hard about manifestations of threat, and we focus on understanding threat environments around the world with an eye toward, well, how can we better protect New York City, mindful of issues that are taking place globally. We have 14 officers who are posted overseas, which is unusual for local law enforcement. We were the first agency to deploy this robust of an entity that are operating overseas. And different from my colleagues on the panel, they are not embedded within embassies or under formal federal authorities, but working almost as ambassadors, law enforcement ambassadors with local law enforcement around the world. And again, the idea is what we call asking the New York question. A threat, a trend, a tactic that's emerging somewhere. What would that look like in our city, and how can we better protect our city? This is obviously AI is taking place in the digital realm, but in the digital realm, which as much that happens in the digital realm, impacting our physical realm already. So we started about probably 11 months ago looking pretty closely as the explosion of generative AI platforms into the mainstream occurred, looking carefully and trying to do some of our own finagling. How many of you all have used ChatGPT or Bard or another LLM in the last 24 hours? Ever. To write your papers? To write briefs, to pass the bar. We've been kind of engaging with people on this topic for a while, and it's interesting to see how quickly it has permeated so many facets of society and made things a lot more efficient in many ways. I engage with it in a very, I would say, useful manner a lot of the time. But we've also been experimenting with and responding to incidents in the wild, and we group them into different categories. But the main ones are cyber threat vectors, and if you guys have been following this issue, you will know that one of the key risks associated with generative AI platforms is the ease and the scale at which malware, phishing, and other cyber threat can manifest. So that's one bucket, and we've seen this. We've seen an explosion of swatting. For those of you who aren't terribly familiar with swatting, it's a tactic in which bomb threats or other emergencies are called into local law enforcement in order to elicit a robust law enforcement response to a venue. So you see campaigns of swatting, and we saw a bunch in September across the country that were targeting houses of worship, primarily but not exclusively Jewish houses of worship, as well as schools. And the idea was live streaming services, huge police response emerges, services get disrupted, house of worship gets emptied out. There's obviously a real public safety risk associated with surging resources. Think about all of the heavy weapons teams I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation being called in for apparent emergency in progress. Big risks can occur. And these are different from swatting campaigns that existed prior to the advent of LLMs being used very in the mainstream, in that they are done by a computer. And so one of the things that we've been trying to do in response is help our 911 operators, our 311 operators, our schools understand how they might respond to a call for a bomb threat in such a way to quickly determine whether it's a computer that's at the other end of the conversation or a human. And that would, in turn, change the course of our response as a law enforcement entity to the call. So that's a new realm of effort for us that we certainly didn't have to think about prior to this era. And I think the real key point about generative AI and all of the public safety risks that I'm going to describe is that none of them are new, inherently new. What's different is the scale and the speed and the democratization of the capability. And that's particularly true in the realm of disinformation. And here we have seen, and we normally when we talk about it, we have a screen and I can show you some cool artifacts, some of which we've made, many of which we've discovered online, that help you get a sense of the evolution. And deepfakes is one example of a technology that has been around, a capability that people have talked about for years, that is now very democratic. Anybody can make one. It's quite easy to do so. And we've seen a pretty incredible increase in the verisimilitude of these deepfakes online. And I think the main concern for us is seeing the polarization and the consequences of polarization in society at this moment. The proliferation of inauthentic content, really, in this conversation, which is supposed to be about ethics, raises some real concerns for us. It raises immediate public safety concerns as a law enforcement agency, but also some more philosophical ones. You have a proliferation of inauthentic content, but then you also have, corollary to that, the specter of inauthentic content, which makes people distrust anything that they are reading and hearing online. And then that ripples down into the very basic and benign. We effected a couple of high-profile arrests in the last few weeks for things totally unrelated to terrorism, which included some documentary evidence of contraband, of whatever the circumstances of arrest were. And now part of a defense package is the argument that this is inauthentic, it wasn't actually true. And so you're going to see this creeping into our criminal justice system in some ways that are pretty easy to predict and some ways that are likely going to be harder to predict. I think fundamentally mistrusting institutions, whether those institutions are academic institutions, media, government, can become quite toxic for society. And we're grappling with some of the kind of hangover effects of the pandemic in that realm. But generative AI and the disinformation that we are already seeing is going to turbocharge those dynamics. This is the first regional war that we are fighting in the era of widespread use of generative AI, and we've seen a fair amount of content circulating that we're chronicling related to what's happening in Israel and Gaza. So images, and some of them have gone viral, and it's been hard to determine whether they are real or fake. You've probably seen some of these images, right? Baby under rubble in a exploded area of conflict, soldiers marching through. I mean, there's obviously a proliferation of real, terrifying, horrible content, but there's also the fake content. And so to the degree that over years to come, it's going to be harder and harder to determine what isn't and what is real, especially for younger folks, and many of you are younger and some are not, but who are consuming so much information and developing so many ideas based on this device. This is going to have near-term, long-term consequences for us societally. So as a result, our agency, we are trying very hard to do something that we often do, which is disseminate information as widely as possible about trends and threats that are emerging. So we are lucky in that we operate in the unclassified context for the most part, and have leaned into having our analysts develop information specifically that can be shared with the public to, again, help make sure everybody is kind of at least understanding the evolution of the threat environment in a way that hopefully we can all concertedly be responding to it. So I'll stop there for the moment and cede to my other panelists.
Amazing. Thank you, Rebecca. John, maybe just turning to you. I think we'd be remiss in having a conversation about AI and national security without contextualizing the kind of great power contestation that has reemerged on the scene of late and is now, in a sense, the defining frame for national security. I know that you've spent a lot of your career in government thinking on that kind of adversarial relationship or those adversarial relationships. And I was wondering if you could begin your remarks with us today by giving us a sense of how an AI arms race, if that's a term that you buy, is unfolding and what implications for national security?
Sure, I'm happy to talk over that. AI, I think, AI is a family of technology. I want to talk about this. Right now, we're in the second generation of AI development. The algorithms that we use, the applications that you've seen, they're not super advanced. They use a technology called neural networks. And the most powerful thing about these technologies is also the worst thing about them. They have emergent behavior. The more advanced, the higher trained they are, the more computing resources we put behind them, the more unpredictable they can become, and the more inscrutable they can become. We can't understand the decisions that they're making. A lot of the use cases that we've talked about today, especially around automated decision making where you have bias, are simpler versions of that technology. And a lot of the things we talk about with regards to generative AI and automated decision-making systems really relate to this second generation. The next step, and this is applicable to the AI arms race, the third generation of technologies, we're going to have far more, by order of magnitude, advanced capabilities, autonomous systems that use what's called recurrent neural networks or recursive neural networks. This is the most advanced type of artificial intelligence technology today, and it's really good at procedural tasks that require complex judgment in a series. So automated driving, for instance, automated vehicles, that's a good example. But anytime you start talking about something that could become a physical public hazard, a public threat, or it could be used in autonomous weapon systems, you're talking about that next generation technology. I do buy the idea of an AI arms race in one perspective. Technologies in warfare have a long history of becoming sort of a fait accompli. The submarine is a really good example. Everyone got up and agreed that it is an immoral use. It's unfair, but countries developed it anyway. It becomes a prisoner's dilemma. If I don't do it and somebody else does it, I need to have that technology. Culminating in naval treaties agreeing to limited use and then control of the technology. The issue with AI, again, the things that make it powerful, that make it great, are also the worst things about it. It's opaque. It's everywhere. We don't know necessarily how it's developed. It's diffuse. It's got a low barrier to entry. A good example here is Google spent billions of dollars developing Bard AI. Open source model, Facebook Meta's Llama model, was leaked. And within a few months, a volunteer network developed an AI of comparable skill in just a few months without spending billions of dollars. So it is very diffuse. All those make it very hard to control. All this leads to me sort of like there's three areas where there is, to frame how we deal with China, or how we deal with this in a great power competition context. There's cooperative, competitive, and combative. There are a few areas where the United States and China have a very shared interest. This technology is a major national security threat from a proliferation standpoint. It has the ability to make very compact, portable, and easy, complex human skill and judgment that can be dangerous, lowering the barrier to things like understanding or making bioweapons, which was referenced in the AI executive order, I think, released by the White House last week. It has the ability to replicate complex human skill, resource-intensive tasks like vulnerability discovery, network penetration, which means it's very useful for cyber attacks. It has the ability to replicate human voices, which is good for social engineering and fraud. I mean, all of those are use cases we're seeing today with I'm not going to say it's antiquated, but it's a very basic form of AI. China shares similar national security concerns, and that's been a common area where the United States and China and other countries have had cooperation. Another area where we do have some cooperation is just in public safety in general, making sure that collectively all of our companies that are developing AI solutions, that tend to be sold overseas are operating from a common series of ethics, have a common set of standards, or a common set of benchmarks for how their products can be evaluated. The United States wants to know that if a Chinese company is going to be selling something in the U.S., that it is a safe and secure product, and likewise China wants the same thing. But the real meat of this is the competitive piece, where the U.S. and China have a stark competition on technology. And that's the leading developments in technology in a military context, utilizing it for intelligence analysis, utilizing it in weapons of warfare, and making sure that our companies have the economic benefit of leading it in overseas trade. The final is combative, and that's where we're looking very starkly at the Chinese use and application of AI in strictly a military context where we come into conflict with the United States. Generally, the scenario envisioned is a scenario over Taiwan. And so China's research and application of that in autonomous weapons, in intelligence analysis, in early warning, and are all sort of major areas where the U.S. is absolutely focused. Those are sort of the three areas where you can evaluate, or as a framework for understanding where the U.S. and China sort of intersect on the field of AI. The thing that's taken up, I think, most of considerations in this discussion is how the U.S. can limit or curb or undercut China's ability to develop AI as a technology. This has largely come in the form of export controls over chips. So we saw there was October 7th of last year was a major refresh of export controls on chips, advanced semiconductors to Chinese companies. And then this was recently refreshed last month as well. The United States is also looking at outbound investment, so curbing or at least tracking capital that is going to Chinese companies or Chinese applications. Now, the principal purpose of this is concern that chips could find their way into military applications or national security applications, which the United States obviously doesn't want to support. But make no mistake, a side effect of this is that it reduces China's economic competitiveness and technological competitiveness as well. So although it's for ostensibly national security purposes, there is an economic component that I think at least, while not set on its face, at least needs to be acknowledged. The final thing is sort of the unspoken area, or the area where the United States has really had difficulty addressing, which is the presence of Chinese technology in the U.S. We've talked about TikTok, WeChat, I mean, two examples, Huawei and ZTE. But when we look forward to AI, it poses a particularly pernicious problem. The United States has very few tools by which it can curb or address what could be high risk or untrusted Chinese AI applications in the domestic U.S. And that continues to be an area of strategic competition, an area that is largely unaddressed. There's been a few executive orders that have been put out to try to address it. The Information Communications Technologies executive order, I think it was released in 2021, or 2020, excuse me. But heretofore, the United States has a sort of asymmetric vulnerability when it comes to China and what it can allow and control in its own market. That's just a broad, I think, framing of, I think, some key areas of strategic competition where there's vulnerability, security concerns from both the U.S. and China side. Happy to keep talking.
Can I add another perspective to that? Because I think something that has always stuck with me from the National Security Commission on AI report.
Jackie, sorry to be this guy. I know the words CIA or those letters are very exciting to everyone in the audience.
So is
And the
CLE.
letters CLE are probably somewhat less exciting, but here goes the CLE mid-presentation announcement because people are waiting at home with bated breath for the code. I'm about to divulge the code. I hope that's okay. I will now be announcing the CLE code for this panel for those attending virtually. As a reminder, virtual attendees will not be able to receive CLE credit without noting this code in the attorney affirmation form after the event. The code is, drum roll please, CCS 2000. Once again, the code is CCS 2000.
Do we have to write it down too to get credit?
No, we're here. We're here.
Just don't
We're
forget
here
to
in
sign
body
in
and in
sign
spirit. Yeah, only those who are attending virtually. Okay, Jackie, over to you.
Sure. I would have made you all break a code to get your CLE, but no, I just wanted to respond to the competition comment, because one of the things that the National Security Commission on AI report, it's only like 700 pages long, you can read it over lunch. They focused on the westernized nations versus more authoritarian nations competition as also a values competition. And I think that's part of why it's so important to consider privacy and civil liberties and civil rights in our use of AI and the government in particular. Because I think that is part of what sets us apart, not just economically, but really from that values point of view. And one of the things I've appreciated about the recent policies and rules that have been put forward is that they're embedding a lot of those values in the law and pushing it not just for the government, but also for the private sector. Because we're seeing an increase of the work that the private sector is doing being even more important in some cases than what the government is doing in protecting those values. So I just wanted to add that to the list that you already put forward.
Jackie, did you want to also share some thoughts of your own as to how the agency, broadly speaking, is conceptualizing AI, employing it, worried about it, and so forth?
Sure. Really, there's not much that hasn't already been covered by some of the other panelists. And we've had a lot of great, public talks recently about our use of AI in large language models. And we talk a lot about the uses at the agency, but it's always through this lens of, how are we building it to be trustworthy? And I think it's really important that we, always discuss the artificial intelligence ethics framework that the IC has, as well as the principles. And, no matter what we do, we have to look at it through that lens, partially because of what the NSC AI report said, which is that it's a values competition. And we, as the government, have to really set the bar high for what those values are. I appreciated Kyle's comments on the first panel along those same lines. But I think for CIA in particular, there's a thought process of AI being used to enhance a human. Kind of similar to what was said previously, it's really not something that's seen in and of itself. It has to really be an entire system that's looked at. Especially from an ethics point of view. It's not just about the technology, it's about the use. It's about where is a human in the loop, who has accountability, what does that look like? So it's really this entire ecosystem of protections that exist, and they exist within our already existing authorities. So we have Attorney General guidelines, we have executive orders, we have legislation, and then our existing oversight. So a lot of the talk has really been about how do we work within our existing structures, and what, if anything, needs to be added to it.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, maybe we could pivot more generally to this question of constraining through law, through ethics, through regulation, possibly through an intervention by Congress. Who knows, maybe even by some kind of international consensus or convention around AI. But I do believe, having listened to your initial interventions, that these questions of how law and how ethics are going to interact with national security operations that are within or adjacent to the AI paradigm are going to be of utmost importance. Maybe a kind of open question to the group. I'm happy to kind of be a little bit more focused if that would be useful. But there's talk nowadays about new regulation. There's a new executive order that was referenced earlier. Among other things, that executive order reaches out to private sector participants in the AI national security game and effectively requires them to share some of their experimentation with the Pentagon or with the government to make sure that there are some kind of ethical and legal boundaries, even within the private sector, observing the fact that there is a necessary continuity in this area between public and private. But I'm wondering if each of you perhaps could say a little something, or whoever wants to take the bait anyway, say something about how you think the regulation in this area is working, or what kind of intervention, whether it's by Congress or by the White House or some other institution, is coming down the pike that informs the conversation.
Maybe we can start a little bit by level setting what some of the real risks are here, because I think a lot of the discussion has maybe been a little diverted in terms of not just really the intelligence community, but the overall risks of AI. I think that once we can have consensus, or at least more close to consensus, on what are the risks in front of us in the next 5 years, 10 years, it's a lot easier to get to what should regulation look like, what should oversight look like. I've heard some interesting things about the risks, and Terminator gets thrown out a lot. That's not really where we're coming at it from. Although if I could do that workout regimen, I think that would be, maybe ChatGPT can create Linda Hamilton's workout regimen for me. But some of the risks that we're looking at are not these huge existential threats that seem to be very prevalent in the media. It's a lot more about making sure that our analysis is correct. So if the president turns and asks you, how do you know this? How can I make a decision on how to act based on this piece of intelligence? Prove it to me. How do we answer that? That is harder because of the black boxes, and because we don't always have explainability to the level that we want. But there's other ways of doing it. So I think not having a correct intelligence is flat out a huge risk for us. It's also not prioritizing our resources. There's a lot that is already ongoing, at CIA and across the intelligence community. It's very important, whether it's for counterterrorism, counterintelligence, or any of the many other missions that we have. But how do we prioritize incorporating AI and incorporating governance into our budgets and into things when we already have so many important things going on, really trying to protect the nation. Also making sure, and I think this is really where this conversation has been important too, is making sure that we are, as a nation, where we need to be to stay ahead and make sure that we still have that advantage, because that is actually a national security threat. If our companies are not engaging at that level, then it can put our government behind from a national security perspective. And then it's been mentioned before, but not being able to upskill the workforce fast enough, and also not being able to maintain the trust of the American people. I really appreciated the comments on the previous panel about how trust is key for us to continue doing our work. We see this in the context of the intelligence community all the time. Our ability to exist is really dependent on our authorities, and our authorities can be taken away if we lose the trust of the American people. So we work really hard to get it right the first time and to set the example. But I think for us, that also means taking a very hard look at what is the real risk in front of us.
I guess, since you did talk about information that had to be shared with the Pentagon, I know you said anyone could answer the question. I felt like, felt like you were winking at me with your words, and now you've done it physically. So there are two thoughts that I think are important that I have, and I thought John's comments are super relevant here as well. There are kind of two big things going on. First is, we've had a really hard time developing laws that are tailored to new technologies, not just AI, but AI is an obvious example. So when you look at the fact, as John mentions, that we are using export controls as a way to try to, as one of the constraints that Sam mentioned, export controls are a firmly established presidential authority, but they start at our nation's borders and then project outward. So if, and I completely agree with John on this point as well, you have people from China who just come into the United States and want to build large language models and aggregate large amounts of cloud infrastructure and do all of those things, then tell me what the difference is between the threat as it can be created outside our country, which we get after with export controls, and the threat that we can create within our own borders, where export controls have nothing to say. So export controls are not a tool that is well aligned to the policy we actually want to reach on technology. That's the first problem, that we're using the wrong tools to try to solve our problems because we have not figured out a way to develop kind of more nuanced tools. And this can be done because Europe is doing it. But there's a big difference between the efficacy of the parliamentary process in Europe and the efficacy of the same process in the city where I work. That's the first issue. The second issue is that I think when John talks about activities that fall within kind of the tier of competition, the most important thing that we are competing for, and Leonard brought this up in the last panel, is private companies. We are trying to win the loyalty and cooperation of companies because I think both China and the United States have recognized that if you compare the capability of a government to push forward in key national security areas, and you contrast that with the ability of the entire private sector to do the same thing, that it is clear that whoever wins the hearts and minds of the private sector is going to have a major advantage in strategic competition. And I happen to think that is actually the only built-in advantage that the United States has in strategic competition. So that means it's one that we need to think carefully about how we leverage, and we need to not lose it. So when you combine those two larger forces, you look, there's a portion of the AI executive order where the administration is dusting off something called the Defense Production Act. And the Defense Production Act is basically, there are a lot of tools that are given to the president in the Defense Production Act, but the most relevant one, which has rarely ever been used, is the president's ability to get information from American companies. And the reason that that authority was created is with an eye toward the fact that the president may need to ask companies to kind of drop what they're doing and switch their priority over to something that the government needs. So we need more widgets immediately because we're at wartime. Let's find a company like Ford or GM that's doing something close but not, they have the right infrastructure, and let's just ask them to drop what, not ask them, let's tell them to drop what they're doing and start making us more widgets. In order to be able to react quickly and to direct these companies in an efficient way, you need to be able to establish an information baseline about what does the capacity within the country look like, where is it, how quickly can it be brought online. And so there's a small portion of the Defense Production Act that allows the president to order companies to basically provide that information so that we can ramp up capacity quickly. Here, the Defense Production Act is being used to do something that, to me at least, feels very different. It's being asked, it's basically being used as a lever to require companies to report on, as far as I can tell, an ongoing, continuous, and indefinite basis. So we're not creating a baseline, we are basically creating an eternal discovery obligation for companies working on what we call dual-use foundation models, which are defined to basically be foundation models that are so powerful that they can do certain threatening things that other foundation models cannot, like produce the formula for new bioweapons, or take down critical infrastructure, or do other things that we would deem to be a threat. And if you are a company in that space, then all of a sudden you are being micromanaged, essentially. So information that relevant to all phases of the process of working with this kind of model has to be turned over to the government. Now, why is that? Is that because the government can't get its hands on a large foundation model if it needs to? Of course not. We know how to get one of these if we need them. We don't have a capacity problem that doesn't look like a traditional DPA issue, but what we're using is we're creating kind of a mismatch between a tool like export controls that we know is in the toolkit and something that we need, which is the ability to force companies to keep giving us information. And we're kind of smashing those two things together as a way not to help enhance capacity, but to help exert control. And so the question is, are we sacrificing kind of our long-term edge in the competition space to win the hearts and minds of companies we really need to be collaborating with, or is this something we need to do in order to exert immediate control? But that was the nature of the discussion that happened prior to the finalization of the EO. I won't go into exactly who held what positions on this, but at the very least, our hope is that the administration will be monitoring the views and reactions of companies that are very important to us strategically to see how they kind of emotionally deal with this.
I'm sorry.
No, go for it.
I have a very, I think, hard take on this. The EO that was uses two horsemen of the apocalypse of congressional interaction: the International Emergency Economic Powers Act and the Defense Production Act. Two tools that the president has to rely upon because Congress continues to leave major areas of law unaddressed. Number one is the largest sector of our economy, the largest companies in the world are entirely ungoverned in the United States. And the United States, among developed nations, is largely ungoverned in the United States at a federal level. And the United States stands alone to develop countries for that. And that's caused confusion with us about who is governing and who is governed. We tried in cybersecurity, we tried for over 10 years to do a public-private collaboration approach. And lots of jawboning on one hand. It doesn't work. Companies will not do what they're supposed to do in good faith over time. And you have to regulate them. We don't have the tools to do so. We don't have a federal privacy law. We don't have a federal tech regulator. So the president has to rely on these emergency authorities because we can't pass legislation. Yeah. There are three categories of risks in my mind. There's the areas that have been unaddressed from a tech perspective, and we mentioned some of those. Echo chambers, issues with epistemic regulators being destroyed, like traditional media, peer review process, et cetera, people being able to curate content, the social problems that cause misinformation is a huge piece of that. AI will amplify that. As long as those issues, core issues, remain unaddressed, the editorial First Amendment privilege of those online regulators, them being public forums but not being legally considered public forums, as long as that's unaddressed, AI will amplify that and it will get worse. The second are the current generation risks, which largely have to do with, are largely covered by existing law. The EEOC, FTC, and DOJ have been unequivocal about this point. You can't point to an AI automated decision-making system and say, that's racist, I'm not. You still have to, you're still responsible for that decision. Companies will respond to that. Litigation will respond to that. The market will respond to that. What's upcoming, though, is applications of AI that are scalable, not trackable, large language models, as they become more generalized, they can move in a bunch of different applications that existing sectoral regulators, they can't govern effectively. Department of Energy can't look at, one model is over here. They can't force them to make a change if it's being used across a number of different sectors. That's one major issue. But as they get more and bigger applications, there's going to come to a point where the public hazard that they present, it becomes something like medicine creation, where the public hazard they could potentially cause outweighs and justifies cost of a certification regime ahead of time. Europe is ahead of this in our regard. We're not there yet. We don't even have the technical standards to judge the reliability of an algorithm or explainability of recurrent. The academic literature is very clear. It's extremely hard, it's time intensive, and we're not very good at it yet. That'll change over time. But we're not at a point where that's the case. The question here is can we muster the political will, political capital, and justification to at least have an incremental approach of a regulator that in time can do an ex-ante certification regime? And you need one thing for that. You need a principles-based approach that can evolve with technology, and you need an agency with broad authority. That hasn't been created since the early 20th century. Congress is not in the mood to create an agency that can have that level of flexibility because industry is never going to allow it. So how we find that divide, how we solve that problem, I'm not very optimistic that we can, but that to me is the single biggest challenge. And I love that industry is really focused on this, but you bring up ex-ante certification, their tone will change. And I would note that in their voluntary commitments earlier this year, it was on frontier models, which is any model that doesn't exist today, which is a metric that they themselves can set. I would just point that out. So
I think the
Sorry.
only thing I would add, again, our perspective is very different because we are not thinking about the production of these technologies. We're not thinking about the way our government and big government is using them. We are focusing on individuals who are engaging with the technology and the public safety and the national security risks that that presents. And I share the skepticism about existing proposed models for regulatory reform of the technology, particularly given the ways in which we've seen it diffuse through society already. And American companies are one thing, and the guardrails that they've created are trying very hard to be effective, and we've jumped to them quite easily and gotten all of the things that you've read about in the paper. How do you ask ChatGPT to tell you how to make a bomb? We've done that in many different ways, and seeing the guidance that some of our, particularly for some reason in the racially and ethnically motivated extremism community online, the tactical guidance, the targeting guidance that has been issued via ChatGPT, the endorsement of using large language models in attack planning and generalized sort of mobilizing to violence, all of that is out there already. I don't see a way for that to change. And so the question for us becomes a much more daily one of how are we as law enforcement keeping up with the mobilization toward violence and other threat vectors that we're seeing coming out of how humans at the individual level are engaging with the technology.
I think something that makes this much more difficult too is, and you had mentioned the democratization of this technology previously, but something that makes this so much more difficult is who should be responsible. So, I mean, the idea of a kind of singular agency that's going to do pre-certifications and things like that kind of assumes that it's the companies developing the AI that should be responsible for the AI, but a lot of the risk is dependent on the use case. So I think that makes it very difficult to regulate. Whereas if you look at privacy as a model, you have different privacy laws for different types of risk. There's different risk in healthcare versus education versus finance. It's a lot easier to put a rule down when you can articulate what the exact risk to an individual is. And I think that's really part of where the rubber meets the road here. And for national security, we have an entirely different set of risks. So, I think there could be space for different schemas for groups that work with national security elements or for procurement from a national security perspective. And those are things that we're always having to think about anyway. I mean, at the end of the day, it's our job to be correct. So a lot of what we require is just good data science and really just having companies do their jobs correctly. So I think some of that can even be done at a contract level, depending on what the expectations are.
Okay, we have a couple of minutes remaining. I'm going to channel a couple of questions that have been posed already, and then I want to save just 2 minutes at the end to talk about some more outlandish scenarios, because we've tended so far to dwell on the more realistic problem set, and I think that's great, but I think it would also be kind of interesting to hear from our panelists about how they're modeling, let's say, tail risk in this area. But here are a set of questions. I'll ask them together, and I'll take a little bit of poetic license. I hope the questioners will forgive me. One of them basically speaks to the offensive and the other to the defensive aspects of AI in warfighting and in intelligence. So on the offensive side, how can or is AI being exploited in intelligence collection, specifically in the collection of open source material and in other offensive capabilities like cyber or kinetic activity, as in drone strikes? That's offense. And on defense, how can the United States effectively defend against employment of AI on the battlefield when the employment of AI by the adversary may not respect the same ethical normative constraints that bind our operators? Have at it.
That's a great question. I'm looking at you, but I can talk a little bit about the open source part of the first question. I think just like any other organization, CIA is having to evaluate how AI can be used to basically help navigate the tremendous amount of information that exists and prioritize it according to our national intelligence priorities framework. That's kind of the overall guidance for what we need to be focusing on, and a lot of our authorities are tied to that. So, we, of course, are looking at ways that we can utilize that type of technology for open source. But for the rest, I have to defer to Jono, so.
No, it's a really good question. So let's start with offense. I think all at the unclassified level, that's what makes this question a beauty. So I think I would say in very general ways, the two ways in which AI is being used offensively are number one, cyber, and John brought this up, and we don't need to flesh out that detail. So cyber is an effective way in which AI is being used. I would say I think the thing that is hindering.
I should also add, just at the institutional level, the NSA the other day, I think, made an announcement that they had stood up an AI center within the National Security Agency.
Right.
Yes.
And if you want to look at where you can expect AI to be used offensively by anyone, then I think one of the hardest dependencies of that is your ability to share your AI and the picture that's being generated through your AI with your partners. And so, one of the primary impediments to using AI on the battlefield is that usually we're trying not to be on the battlefield by ourselves. We're trying to be there with a coalition. And so one of the hardest ways in which we try to earn our paychecks every day is figuring out how, with the regime of export controls, with kind of all the policies that hinder kind of free and open sharing of sensitive technology and sensitive information, we can create a common picture of the battlefield with our partners. And that is extremely difficult, which is why cyber, which is something that can be done more, quote unquote, individually and autonomously, is one of the areas where I think folks are leaping ahead on the offensive front. The other thing I would say is it really helps with precision. So there are things that we can do with AI in terms of dealing with large quantities of information that allow us to build more sophisticated filters that basically show the human being less rather than more. So dealing with the problem of abundance. And that, I think, is allowing us, and I think the hope from a humanity perspective is that the human and the machine are working together in order to kind of shrink the picture of what's relevant, to limit things like collateral damage, but kind of when we are in kind of a combat situation, I think that is, I don't want to say low-hanging fruit, but lower hanging fruit. In terms of playing defense against AI, I think we have a long way to go. I think there are initiatives we are starting to think about. If there are bad things that can happen when you ask malevolent questions of generative AI, why can't we ask those questions first, figure out what the answer is going to be, and get out in front of some of the things that we're afraid of? I think one of the other kind of major realms, and not going to get into too much detail, but the area of kind of counter-analysis. So if you think of the most productive way that I visualize AI is basically like kind of a virtual avatar. Like it is an agent. It is something that is operating as humans are used to operating, except it can do certain things a lot more effectively. So how do you trick that agent if you're dealing with an avatar that's being used by your enemy, and how do you prevent kind of your own avatar from being tricked? So this kind of in the realm of how, can you drop kind of fake data points or create fake events or create real minor events that will be misread by your adversary's AI in order to lead their AI to inoptimal solutions. And if you do that, could your opponent's AI do something wild and unproductive that violates the law of war and kills a bunch of innocent people in ways that you don't necessarily intend? So those are some of the questions we're wrestling with. I think a lot more is to come kind of in the next few years, but that's as honest an answer as I can give at the unclassified level about where we're at right now. Over.
We have literally a minute left. Should we just do a quick run down the panel and do a speed round, a parting thought.
Can I just hear what your crazy situation is? Because now that you've teased it, I feel like I'll be missing
Let
out.
me set it up this way. Rebecca is here today as Commissioner of Counterterrorism and Intelligence. In her previous life, she was also an expert on nuclear deterrence, and she comes by that honestly because her grandfather, Stanislav Ulam, was one of the great founders of the Manhattan Project and one of the great mathematical physicists of the 20th century. He had worries about AI. Rebecca, maybe just kind of over to you to kind of share a parting thought.
Parting thought. Again, I wish I had the actual quote, but you know, one of the things that we like to do is remind people that the long history of how humans engage with technology has had many dark moments, but a conversation that took place between my grandfather and a physicist, a Hungarian physicist who some of you might have heard of, named Johnny von Neumann, who was very instrumental in developing modern computers. I won't tell you the era, but they were discussing what is often referred to in the tech community as the singularity, a moment at which the development and evolution of technology would get to a place where, as he described it, the course of human affairs as we know them could no longer continue. And this was in 1958 that they were gesturing at this moment. And so a lot of folks have recently returned to it, in particularly the conversations around risk of extinction associated with some of these technologies. And one of the cool things that we did was actually voice clone him, my grandfather, saying this as he did back in 1958 when the conversation happened, even though he died when I was 7. And it's a powerful reminder of many cool ways in which the technology is used. But I think the fundamental question, and you know, listening to you talk about the realm of the realistic, which involves this kind of dual level AI wargaming about the future of military conflict, we are in some ways in uncharted territories, and those who understand the technology at the level of science have many different things to say about it. But one thing that feels very true is that we're all gesturing with a huge gulf of uncertainty in front of us, knowing that this is going to seep into our everyday lives in ways that it hasn't already, but has started to, in some unpredictable manners, in a moment of great contest around the globe. And so we really have to all be thinking very hard and smart about what that means for us.
Drop the mic.
Yeah. I think for me, not that I'm like not even going to try to top that, but I think the parting thought that I would have for this audience is a question of, and I am kind of stealing this from a talk that I heard from one of the co-authors of the White House's Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. And it's when you're looking at developing an AI or a use of AI, take a look around you and look at who's not in the room and ask who stands to benefit from this and who does not stand to benefit from this. I think that conversation has really shaped the way that I think about risk and think about who, we're so lucky where we are that, probably every single person brought a cell phone in with them. A lot of people don't have that technology. They don't necessarily even know what AI is. So think about those people when you're developing these and thinking about what, maybe this existential risk, or who's not in the room, or who may have an environmental impact of something that you're building. It's really hard, I think, for us, to comprehend that unless we are very proactively asking ourselves that question and holding others to hold us accountable for that. So that would be my parting thought. Of course, that's just from Jackie. That's not from the CIA. But if you take one thing away, I think it would be making sure we're thinking of people who aren't part of the discussion.
Please thank me in thanking John, Rebecca, Jackie, and Jono for an extraordinarily erudite and fascinating conversation.